Hello and welcome again to my place. Recently, in response to certain things that were printed in the Herald and our local paper, I wrote a letter to the editor of the Northern Advocate, which was kind of long and way past uh, what the limit of their requirements was. So I really didn't expect it to be published, and it subsequently wasn't. But I wrote it anyway because I didn't mind if it wasn't for the public anyway, in a sense, because I just wanted to let the editor know certain things. So here I am again today after a little bit of a break, and I just want to share with you people the letter. On June 17th, the New Zealand Herald published a piece about Rohingya Muslims who had fled sectarian-fueled violence in their native Myanmar and sought refuge in India, only to find that same enmity follow them after Facebook posts surfaced that characterized them as cannibals and thus stirred up animosity in their new home. Just the previous evening, I'd watched a documentary showing the plight of Uyghur Muslims, some of whom had sought refuge as far away as the United States. In all of the heightened awareness and sensitivity in New Zealand since the atrocious attacks on mosques in Christchurch, one thing stands out. The correlation between hate speech and violence is clear. It's no accident of history that some wit exclaimed, "The pen is mightier than the sword." Ideas have consequences, and the planting of ideas, of bad ideas, in the human psyche always results in a harvest of evil consequences. The more hate-fueled the ideas, the more terrible its eventual harvest. But in our newfound quest to hunt down these hate-fueled ideas, we should also take care to make certain distinctions. Mainstream media have in general been very careful to distinguish between terror attacks by Muslims, over 30,000 of them since 9/11, in various parts of the world, and ordinary peace-loving Muslims who make up the vast majority. Of those 30,000 attacks by Muslims, the majority of victims were in fact other Muslims. By and large, the media, and particularly in New Zealand, and government, the support for peace-loving Muslims is very apparent. No doubt this has contributed to the prevention of serious backlashes against Muslims. Hate speech criteria should be even-handed. It should be applied consistently, wherever it's found. Sometimes the charge of hate speech is itself fueled by hatred. To ignore this possibility is to court a form of blindness and create potential for hate-fueled actions where hate becomes officially sanctioned, which is the worst form of hatred. Just how people have played the race card and have weaponized the charge of racism as an act of unwarranted aggression against a detractor, just as the charge of anti-Semitism has been cited aggressively to ward off all criticism of Israel, we need to be aware that not all charged as being Islamophobes actually hate Muslims. This distinction, which I allude to, is the difference between the potential extent of violence, hatred which is fueled by individuals such as those who take to Facebook to vent their vitriol, bears no comparison to the scale and extent of the sort of hatred that is encouraged systemically. Officially sanctioned hatred, such as the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi instigated by high-ranking political and military officials in the Hutu-dominated government, is always going to be so much worse. Systemic hatred embedded in an authority ensures a sense of justification, ensures the severity and extent geographically and over time of the violence. The official sanction of hatred for Jews by Nazis at the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution was finalized, is another example of systemic, officially sanctioned hatred. There alone are over 6 million reasons why authoritative hate speech, systemically justified, is especially tragic. This is why I want the reader to examine carefully what I say next. If I were to cite the percentage of Māori in New Zealand and its relation to the proportion of Māori in our jails, I might be called a racist. But to do that is to assert you have an inside perception of my motives. I'm simply stating facts. I'm not a racist, but I do realize that people who share common ancestry often also share common cultural beliefs and attitudes. Ideology is what drives behaviour, not skin colour. But people playing the race card are often hindering the solution and conflating the issue. In the same way, I might be called an Islamophobe, but here again, I'm simply stating what are the demographic realities of these countries. It is the driving ideology, the cultural coherence that these nations have in common, which are the driving force for the poor showing that I'll shortly exemplify here. Obviously, these countries are diverse ethnically, yet hold a particular ideology in common. And this clearly correlates with the least peaceful of the world's nations in at least 6 out of the 10 countries shown. What am I talking about? On June 20th, the New Zealand Herald published an article headed, "New Zealand ranked the second most peaceful country in the world," in which a map featured the top 10 most peaceful and the bottom 10 least peaceful nations. While interesting, the most salient facts are ignored. Most people are aware that the amount of melanin in your skin is not itself a determining factor for the level of violence that you're likely to commit. Neither your ethnicity nor your nationality are contributing factors. What is important are the beliefs that are held in common culturally. It is the ideology that drives culture, which is the predominant factor determining the level of violence in these countries. Unfortunately, the map shown masks these determining factors. 6 out of the 10 least peaceful countries are predominantly Islamic by ideology. They range from 82% Muslim by religion to 99.8%, depending on your sources. There are indications that where Islam may only be as much as a few percent of the population in the other 4 countries, very militant forms of Islam are linked to violence and give rise to the poor showing of at least 2 of those other 4 countries. Now, compare this with cultures of the top 10 most peaceful countries of the world. Undoubtedly, although racially and ethnically diverse, most of those cultures are either directly ideologically Western in origin or strongly influenced by Western values and culture in more recent times. And it doesn't take much research to understand the link between the success of the West as a cultural force for good globally and the influence on the values held by the West, like the sanctity and equality of humanity under a common rule of law, which are all values ideologically underpinned by a Judeo-Christian ethic. Hate speech, remember I said that systemic hate speech is always going to be far more tragic. Hate speech is systemic in the Quran, supported by the other authoritative texts, the Hadith and Sirah, though many Muslims are not aware of it or pretend that it doesn't exist. I'll show you here an excerpt from the Quran, which is shown in Arabic and in English, and it's quite clear what it says. Here's one example. The God of Islam, Allah, commands Muslims, when they have sufficient numbers, to violently subjugate Christians and Jews. Allah says in Surah chapter 9:29, fight those who believe not in Allah. Notice it says fight those who do not believe, not fight in self-defense. This is a command to fight people based on their beliefs. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth from among the people of the book, until they pay the jizya, a discriminatory tax imposed on the infidel, those who don't follow Islam, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Muslims are commanded to fight Christians and Jews until they pay tribute to them and feel themselves subdued. Muslims are sometimes not aware of this or are kept from this understanding by their imams. Nevertheless, this is how many get radicalized. This is just a part of it. You can see that Christians and Jews have to acknowledge their inferiority and accept their place as second-class citizens who don't have the same rights as Muslims. This command has probably led to more oppression than any other command in history. My thanks to David Wood for bringing this to light. The application of hate speech sanctions need not only to be consistent, but must be seen to be consistent. In this, the mainstream media, and to some extent the government, are abysmal failures. And partly why people are abandoning mainstream media, losing trust in its abilities, who are perceived as abdicating the responsibility to be the fourth estate. This is partly the reason for the uptake of alternative media. And it will not stop until we see a return of the media to an attempt, at least an attempt, at non-partisan reporting and objectivity. Left-leaning political biases and the mistaken sense of secular neutrality are largely responsible for this state of affairs. To those who would level the accusation of hatred and bias towards Muslims at me, let me refer the reader to a national leader, himself a Muslim, and what he had to say about Islam. On June 18th, the New Zealand Herald, this is June 18th, 2019, the New Zealand Herald reposted an article from the New York Times lamenting the death of Egypt's first democratically elected leader, Mohamed Morsi, while on trial after reportedly suffering dire conditions in jail, exacerbating a prior health condition. What is not elaborated on is that Morsi was an Islamist involved with the Muslim Brotherhood, heavily involved in extremist rhetoric with a violent history. Western media seem unable to appreciate that where Islam is the predominant ideology, democracy has little chance of survival because the culture is heavily steeped in a theocratic worldview. In Islam, the struggle of life isn't about individuality or personal choice. It's about pleasing Allah. A democracy assumes individual and personal autonomy, concepts which are not compatible with a totalitarian and all-absorbing worldview as Islam is. This is why all Islamic-dominated countries, even where democracy is touted, suffer from totalitarian or at least overtly authoritarian governments. The leader who deposed Morsi militarily and who was later elected president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, a Muslim himself, addressed the nation's top Islamic authorities and clerics. He located radical terrorism within the sphere of authentic Islam. And I quote, "That thinking that is responsible for producing anxiety, danger, killing, and destruction around the world." I'm not saying religion, but thinking, that corpus of texts and ideas that we have sacralized over the centuries to the point that departing from them has become almost impossible, is antagonizing the entire world. It's antagonizing the entire world. Questioning classical Islam, which divides up the world into two warring hemispheres, the Muslim world Dar al-Islam, which must forever be in a struggle with the rest of the world, or Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, till, in the Quran's words, all religion belongs to Allah. Quran 8:39. Islamic academic Raymond Abraham, commenting on Sisi's speech: "As a Muslim, Sisi will not say that Islam, the religion, is responsible for antagonizing the entire world, but he certainly goes much further than his Western counterparts when he says that this thinking is rooted in an Islamic corpus of texts and ideas which have become so sacralized."
والله لأحاجيكم يوم القيامة أمام الله سبحانه وتعالى على اللي أنا بتكلم فيه ده دلوقتي. أنت مش ممكن تكون وأنت جواه حاسس بيه.
The wildly divergent way in which the Muslim massacres in Christchurch is treated by media compared to the proliferation of ongoing and horrendous persecution of Christians globally is surely a testament to the prejudices of mainstream media. And I think many people, just to cite an example in our own neck of the woods, many people, while not agreeing with Israel Folau, would certainly see that he is being hounded and systemically persecuted because he spoke some beliefs in public. Christians remain one of the most persecuted religious groups in the world. While Christian persecution takes many forms, it's defined as any hostility experienced as a result of identification with Christ. Christian torture remains an issue for believers throughout the world, including the risk of imprisonment, loss of home and assets, physical torture, beheadings, rape, and even death as a result of their faith. And I might add that a similar thing, like the exodus of the Jews out of France and England and other places in the world shows a pattern. Trends show that countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East are intensifying persecution against Christians, and perhaps the most vulnerable are Christian women, who often face double persecution for both faith and gender. Every month, on average, 345 Christians are killed for faith-related reasons. 105 churches and Christian buildings are burned or attacked. 219 Christians are detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned. This comes from opendoors.org, USA. And just imagine that is going on every month as an average. The recent conflagration in Hong Kong, epitomizing Western values in sharp contrast to the totalitarianism of communist China, is another of those issues highlighting the effect of ideology on the well-being of people. Some have characterized the conflict between China and Hong Kong as a conflict between communism and Christianity. And an unofficial anthem of the protests was "Sing Hallelujah to the Lord." This comes from Christian Broadcasting Network. Just another snippet willfully ignored by mainstream media prejudice. It's high time the Western press, with a show of magnanimity and with regard to the truth, started introspectively examining some of the cultural prejudices and ideological biases and bigotry by which they refuse to report these sorts of things in an objective and unbiased manner. Thanks for joining me. Goodbye.